Hello and welcome to For Knit's Sake, episode 10. I'm currently doing the A to Z of crafting, and seeing as tomorrow is International Women's Day, I thought I would do I for International Women's Day. And as this is mainly a knitting podcast, I have gone down a big rabbit hole of knitting spies, and I can't get over how cool it is. Big rabbit hole the past few weeks. So everything I've researched is just bumbling about in my head, but I did sit down and write it all out, so hopefully I do okay with this. So the idea of this podcast episode came about because of work. So we do a weekly creative project and people are doing writing and artwork for International Women's Day. It got me thinking about women and knitting, so I just did a bit of research and then here we are. So I guess the only way to get into it is to begin. I have mentioned in my previous episode that I'm not a historian. I mention it quite a lot. But I have done a lot of research for this episode and I think I'm going to be okay. I thought I would start with a brief history of knitting during World War I. So knitting began as an innocent way, not spy knitting. So knitting during the First World War was innocent, like I say, not spy knitting. The Red Cross put out calls for millions of knit items, with the quote famously known as "knit your bit." I say famously known, I don't know how famously known it is. We're off to a great start. The Red Cross supplied patterns for sweaters, socks, mufflers and fingerless mitts, which allowed soldiers to keep their hands warm while shooting. The Red Cross knitters even created medical supplies, and I just discovered this I've been researching this a lot, and I found that out the other day. I thought that was so cool. They created medical supplies. They knitted stretchy bandages from cotton yarn that were sterilised and used in the field. Like, how cool is that? They knitted covers for stumps in both arm and leg size. They knitted toe covers to fit over the ends of casts. Soldiers were even given knitting needles themselves as they laid in hospitals, both to aid the war effort and for a kind of occupational therapy, to give them something constructive to focus their energies upon. I love that. The very famous magazine Life did a how to knit in 1941, 24th of November, along with basic instructions and a pattern for a simple knitted vest. The article said, "To the great American question, what can I do to help the war effort? The most common answer yet found is knit." Thousands of Americans picked up their needles to knit socks, mufflers and sweaters to keep American soldiers warm. The knitting groups turned out an amazing amount of clothing and other items for the war effort. One group alone, called the Three Point Knitters, only 30 women, within the span of 3 months, turned out 244 knitted garments, representing 4,290 work hours. Do you see what I mean? Do you see how easy it is to get sucked into this whole? It's a really fascinating, the whole history of knitting, especially during the war. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was often photographed knitting for the war effort, or at least carrying her massive knitting bag. She effectively launched the World War II knitting effort at a Knit for Defence tea held at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City on September 31st, 1941. Knitting for troops continued throughout World War II, even Queen Elizabeth, but before she was Queen, she also knitted for troops during this era. She's so old, isn't she? She's lived through a lot. And before Pearl Harbor, American knitters were preparing care packages for allies like Britain and France containing food and knit items. This is a cool quote I found. "The Navy needs men, but it also needs knitters." So I found this very interesting. It says frowned upon, but I reckon it was more than that. So basically, knitters couldn't knit personal items during the war. It was frowned upon, as was hoarding yarn. They were expected to return completed items or return the yarn within a month. So you couldn't knit your baby a blanket. It all had to be towards the war. I'm not sure how I feel about that. It puts a lot of pressure on knitters, doesn't it? But obviously it was for good things, but at the same time you must have felt a massive amount of pressure as a knitter. And a lot of knitters, because of this, didn't knit after the war, even though they were really into it before the war. So obviously this started as just innocently knitting for the troops, to keep them warm and things. But then, during the Second World War, light bulb moment, they realised that they could use the inconspicuousness of knitting to send secret messages, and as knitting was commonplace back then, you wouldn't look at someone just randomly knitting in a train station or on a bench. Like, knitting was like just normal, like an everyday occurrence, something you don't go, "Oh, she's knitting." Like nowadays, if someone's knitting public, like, "Oh, she's knitting," but that was not a thing back then because it was such commonplace. They used stenography, which is a way to hide coded messages in physical objects, and the knitters used this technique. They used a specific combination of knit and purls in their patterns that could be passed on. Whether women knitted codes into fabric or used stereotypes as knitting women as cover, there's definitely a history between knitting and this word, espionage. How good is that word? Like, those knitting and espionage together, just like music to my ears. So from the book A Guide to Code and Signals from 1942, it says, spies have been known to work code messages into knitting, embroidery, hooked rugs, etc. So that's the brief history of knitting in war, and now I'm going to go into the spies. I hope everyone's as excited about this as I am. I don't know, I never heard of it, and like I say, since I started this podcast, I'm learning a lot about the history of knitting. So, knitting spies began... I typed those words out, it sounds so lame. Knitting spies began in the United States Revolutionary War, which was the 19th of April 1775 until the 3rd of September 1783. I've done my research, you see. In this time, British troops took over the homes of colonials during the war. This one lady, Molly Mom, I honestly don't know how to say mum in America. Mom. Molly Mom, Rinker of Philadelphia, was one of George Washington's spies, and the British troops quartered themselves in a house, and they didn't allow the men of the household into the kitchen, like the dining area, but obviously she's a woman, so she had to serve them. But she used this to her advantage, and it was here that she listened closely to their conversations. She would then write the information down on a small piece of paper, and this is so cool. She would wrap the piece of paper with a note on around a stone, and then wrap yarn around the stone until she had a very normal looking ball of yarn. She would then take this yarn ball to a rock overlooking some woods. There she would sit and knit, and then she would drop the ball of yarn off the rock and into the woods below, and one of George Washington's men would ride by and grab the yarn and pass the message on to learn about British military secrets. This is like the history, so honestly I don't care that she was working against the British us because it's just so cool. And then there's another one. There's a lot. A French woman named Madame Lavengie would sit in front of her window and knit. As she knitted, she would watch troop movements from the window and tap her feet on the floor to send codes to her children. So I'm guessing that's like Morse code because it's like the sound. And her kids would be pretending to do schoolwork on the floor below. The children would then write the codes down, and this all went unnoticed by the Germans like the whole time. I don't know, I just find this whole thing fascinating. And then there's also the very famous, I say very famous, but obviously I don't know about this recently, but she is the one that everyone knows about. If you know about knitting spies, like, she's the one your brain goes to first. So Phyllis Latour Doyle was a secret agent for the British War during World War II. She parachuted into Normandy in 1944 and chatted with German soldiers under the pretense of being helpful. Then she would return to her knitting kit, where she had a silk yarn ready to be filled with secret knotted messages. She would then translate using Morse code equipment, and she told the New Zealand Army News in 2009, "I always carried knitting because my codes were on a piece of silk. When I used a code, I would just pinprick it to indicate it had gone. I wrapped the piece of silk around a knitting needle and put it in a flat shoelace which I used to tie my hair up." Oh, that's just amazing. There was also the Belgian resistance during World War II, who recruited women who had windows overlooking railway yards. They were to note the German train movements with their knitting, so purl one for one type of train, drop on stitch intentionally to make a hole into the fabric for another train. They were knitting these into scarves and blankets and hats. It just looked like a fancy pattern, so they would obviously note the train, and then they would knit it into the brim of the hat or anywhere at the scarf. It would just look like a stitch, not like a secret code, and the people that they were passing on to knew it was a code. But if they were to be stopped by someone, it would honestly just look like knitting. They eventually this caught on, and they actually banned like posting knitting patterns, because as a knitter, like, you know what a pattern looks like, it's not like coded, but to non-knitters it does look like a code. So they banned it because they thought if you write a code, it could be put into a knitting pattern. Forget like the knitted piece, you could just write knit one, purl one as a code, if you see what I'm saying. So it's kind of like a secret code anyway, and if you don't understand it, you can write anything you want into it to make a secret code. And this caused a lot of paranoia around what knitting patterns might mean. So during World War II, the Office of Censorship in the US banned people from posting knitting patterns abroad, since the instructions could in fact disguise military secrets. And I don't know, it just is so cool. And then I found a few artifacts. I found this Red Cross pin gauge. And then I also found the American Red Cross knitting needles. There was a lot of information in there, and I thought it would take me like an hour to read out. I think because I was doing a lot of research, and it's like cooking, isn't it? Like you cook a meal and you eat it faster than it was to cook, and that's what's just happened here with all my research. After reading it out and writing it, I feel like I've covered everything about the knitting spies, and I don't know, I think that's my favourite history fact about knitting, the fact that there was spies, knitting spies. So let me know in the comments below if I missed anything. Thank you for watching, and my next video is going to be J for Jeanette. That's my mum. It's just me and her like interviewing each other about knitting, and she taught me how to knit, so I thought it would be a nice little sit down chat thing. Alright, thank you for watching, and if you're new here, please subscribe, and if you're not new here, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye.